Chapter 19. Luke left Jen's that day with a pile of books and computer printouts clutched to his chest. "Some reading material for you," she'd said, "so you'll understand." Back in his own room, Luke sat down on his bed and opened the first book. It was thick and carried its title in ominous black letters, "The Population Disaster." The type inside was small and closely spaced. Luke read a sentence at random. "While debate continues over the carrying capacity of the Earth," he skipped ahead, "if the total fertility rate in industrialized countries had remained at or below 2.1, Luke saw that reading this book would be like puzzling out the letters Dad got from the government. He glanced at the other two books. The Famine Years Revisited and The Population Reversal. They both looked no easier. The computer printouts were at least brief, means short, but both The Problem of the Shadows and The Population Law, Our Country's Biggest Mistake, were full of big words. Luke sighed. He was tempted to put the books aside and just ask Jen to explain them to him. And he might have, except for what she'd said as she'd begun handing them to him. "Oh my gosh, I didn't think. You can read, can't you?" "Of course," Luke had answered stiffly. "I was reading in the chat room, wasn't I?" "Yes, but you could have been... Oh, never mind. I've offended you again, haven't I? Me and my big mouth. It wouldn't have anything to be ashamed of, even if you couldn't. Oh, I'm making things worse. I'll shut up. Here." And it had seemed to Luke that she'd pulled even bigger books off the bookshelves after that. Now he resolutely turned to the beginning of The Population Disaster and began reading. "Since some elements of the overpopulation crisis were foreseen in the 1800s, an uninformed observer could only wonder why humankind came so near to total annihilation. But..." Luke reached for the dictionary and settled in for the long haul. It rained for the next several days, so Luke read constantly, not even tempted to race over to Jen's instead. He could hear Dad banging around downstairs, stomping in and out from the barn or the machine shed. Now that the harvest was in, Luke thought Dad might be bored without the pigs to take care of. So Luke read cautiously, always ready to shove his population book under his pillow and replace it with one of his adventure books. The preparation paid off on the fourth day when he heard Dad's footsteps on the stairs. "Hey, Luke, what are you up to?" "Nothing," Luke said, turning Treasure Island right side up at the very last minute. Dad didn't notice. "Want to play cards?" They played rummy on Luke's bed. Luke could feel the corner of The Population Disaster poking his back throughout the entire game. And he kept wanting to ask Dad about what he was learning. He spent most of the first game biting his tongue. Dad won. "Again?" Dad asked, shuffling the cards. "If you don't have any work you've got to do. In November, with no livestock. Only work I've got now is figuring out how we're going to pay our bills once the hog money runs out." "Isn't there some way to grow stuff inside during the winter, like down in the basement with special lights, lots of water and extra minerals, and then you could sell it?" Luke asked without thinking. He'd just finished reading a chapter in the population book about hydroponics. Dad squinted. "Seems I did hear tell of that once." Luke won the next hand. Dad didn't seem to be concentrating. At the end, Dad said, "Mind if we quit now?" Luke was terrified Dad would ask where he'd heard of hydroponics, so he just said, "No problem." Dad left, muttering, "Growing food inside. Luke wished he'd had the nerve to ask about the population law or the famines or even some family history. Once he got past the dense language, the books Jen had loaned him were full of revelations. As best he could understand it, the world had simply gotten too full of people about 20 years earlier. Poor countries had it particularly bad, and people there often starved or were malnourished. But then something worse happened. Terrible droughts struck the parts of the world that always grew the most food. That means like there's no rain and so it's too dry, stuff won't grow. For 3 years, they grew almost nothing. People everywhere starved. In Luke's country, the government began rationing food, only allowing people to have 1,500 calories a day. And to make sure there was food, they seized control of all food production. They forced factories that had made junk food to crank out healthy food instead. They forced farmers to move to land that would be more likely to produce. Isn't that why we don't live near our grandparents? Luke wanted to ask his parents. But the government didn't think that was enough. They wanted to make sure there would never again be more people than the farmers could feed. So they passed the population law too. In the evenings, spooning in his stew or cutting up his meat, Luke felt pangs of guilt now. Perhaps someone was starving someplace because of him. But the food wasn't there, wherever the starving people were. It was here, on his plate. He ate it all. Luke, you're so quiet lately. Is everything all right? Mother asked one night when he waved away second helpings of cabbage. I'm fine, he said, and went back to eating silently. But he was worrying that maybe the government was right and that he shouldn't exist. Only when he got to the 2 computer printouts did he begin to feel better. One of the articles began, "The population law is evil." The other said, "Hundreds of children are hidden, mistreated, starved, neglected, abused, even murdered, for no reason. Forcing children into the shadows can be counted as genocide." "How can this be?" he asked Jen a week later when he finally got a chance to go back to her house. "How can the books and the articles be so different?" She handed him a glass of soda. "What do you mean?" she asked. Luke pointed to the population disaster. "This book says the human race would have gone extinct if we hadn't had the population law. And this," he held up and shook the Problem of the Shadows article, "this says the population law was totally unnecessary and cruel. It says there was plenty of food, even during the famines, except that the barons were hoarding it." Belatedly, he remembered that Jen was a baron. "Sorry." Jen shrugged, not the least bit offended. "So, what's the truth?" Luke asked. Jen shook potato chips into a bowl. "Well, think about it. The government allowed those books to be published. They probably even paid for them. So, of course, they're going to say what the government wants people to believe. They're just propaganda, lies. But the articles, the authors of those, probably put themselves at risk getting the information out. So, they're right." Luke pondered that. "Then why do you make me read the books?" he asked. "So you'd understand how stupid the government is," Jen said. "So you'd understand why we have to make them see the truth." Luke looked at the stack of thick books on the Talbots' kitchen counter. They looked so official, so important. Who was he to say they weren't true? Chapter 20. Luke feared he'd have to wait months between visits to Jen once the snow started. But the weather proved kind that winter. Most days were dry and clear. He didn't have leafy trees to hide behind, but he began to feel safe anyway, crawling through his and Jen's backyards. By mid-January, he could make the entire journey without his heart beating abnormally at all. The odds against someone watching from one of the other barren houses seemed too astronomical to worry about. His only concern was Dad. Dad usually hung around the house a lot during the winter. Without the hogs to tend to, he could easily have been there even more than usual, preventing Luke from ever sneaking out. But suddenly Dad had taken to heading to town many mornings, yelling up at Luke, "I'm going to the library. You've got something up there to eat for lunch, don't you?" Or, "There's some plastic tubing over to Slyton I want to check out. Tell the boys when they get in from school, you hear?" "It's that hydroponics notion," Luke bragged to Jen one day in late January while they were sitting at the computer together. I got Dad all excited about it, and now he's too busy with that to notice what I do. What's hydroponics? Jen asked. It was in one of your books. You know, growing plants indoors without soil, just using water and special minerals. Oh, Jen said. Does he think the government would actually let him do that? I guess so, Luke said. Why wouldn't they? Jen shrugged. Why does the government do anything? Luke didn't have an answer to that. Jen turned back to the computer chat room where everyone was debating fake IDs. Carlos. Mom says they won't buy me one until I'm 18 because she thinks the government wouldn't challenge an adults as much, and maybe they'll be cheaper then. Pat. Maybe Sean and I will get ours by the time we're 90. Dad and Mom have been saving them for as long as we can remember. Yolanda. My dad says he's waiting to find one that's foolproof. He says there are too many bad ones out there. Jen began typing furiously. Who needs a fake ID? Carlos, they'd probably get one for you that says John Smith, and you'd have to spend the rest of your life trying to pass for an Anglo. My parents have been begging me to get a fake ID for years, but I won't until I can have one that says Jen Talbot, and it is really mine. Have you all forgotten the rally? We're all going to get real IDs that say who we really are. We aren't fakes. We shouldn't have to hide. She jabbed the enter button so hard the computer shook. But Jen, Luke said timidly, I thought you used a fake ID to go shopping with your mom. It said you were her niece. Jen turned her fierce gaze on Luke. No, that was just a shopping pass, she said. I don't like using that either, but I figured I can't fight my parents about everything. What they're talking about, she pointed at the computer screen, is taking on a fake identity permanently. Most shadow kids do that eventually. They go live with another family and pretend to be someone they aren't for the rest of their lives. So, you'd rather hide? Luke asked. He thought about using a different name, living in a different family, being a different person. He couldn't imagine it. No, of course I wouldn't rather hide, Jen said irritably. But getting one of those IDs, that's just a different way of hiding. I want to be me and go about like anybody else. There's no compromise. Which is why I've got to convince these idiots that the rally's their only chance. There was a shocked blankness on the computer screen after Jen's entry. Then Carlos ventured. Jen? Got any of your parents' blood pressure medication handy? Sounds like you need it. Jen stabbed the power button on the computer. The screen instantly went dark. She spun around in her chair and clenched her fists. "Ah!" she screamed with a grimace of frustration. Jen? Luke asked. He leaned away from her in case she decided to use those clenched fists. Jen turned to Luke in surprise, as though she'd forgotten he was there. Don't you ever feel like saying, I can't take this anymore? She asked. She leaped up and began pacing the floor. Don't you ever just want to walk out into the sunshine and say, forget hiding, I don't care. Am I the only one who feels this way? No, Luke whispered. She whirled around and pointed at the computer. Then what's wrong with them? Why don't they understand? Why aren't they taking this seriously? Luke bit his lip. I think, he said, people just have different ways of expressing what they feel. Those kids make jokes and complain. You run around screaming your head off and tackling people. He was proud of himself for figuring that out, considering he really only knew 5 people in the whole world. But for the first time, he wondered how the rest of his family would cope if any of them had to hide. Dad would get grumpy. Mother would try to make the best of it, but you'd be able to tell that she was really unhappy. Matthew would be quiet, but would look sad all the time, the way he looked every time anyone mentioned the pigs they couldn't keep anymore. Mark would gripe so much that he'd make everyone miserable. For the first time, Luke felt a glimmer of pride that he dealt with hiding better than anyone else in his family would, he thought. Jen snorted at his explanation. Whatever, she said. She slid back into her chair by the computer. But the rally is in April, I've got 3 months to make sure everyone's ready. She switched on the computer and began typing furiously again. Luke slipped away a few hours later. He wasn't sure Jen noticed him leaving. Chapter 21. In February, Dad got the letter from the government forbidding him from trying to grow anything indoors. It has come to our attention that you have been purchasing excess amounts of plastic pipe, such as is used in the germination, cultivation, and development of vegetative manner in an interior structure, the letter began. Due to the preponderance of such agricultural methods in the cultivation of illegal substances, we order you to cease and desist immediately. Luke read the letter at supper after everyone else in the family had had a stab at trying to figure out what it meant. Somehow, after reading all the big books that Jen had loaned him, he didn't find the fancy words so daunting. They want you to stop, Luke said. They're scared you're going to grow something illegal. And this part, he pointed at the letter, although everyone else was at the table several feet away and he was in his usual spot on the stairs. This part where they say, render all such materials for our adjudication, that means you have to turn over all the stuff you bought and they'll decide if they're going to fine you or not. The rest of the family looked at Luke in amazement. Then Mark started giggling. Drugs? He said. They think you're going to grow drugs. Dad flashed him a look of pure disgust. Think it's funny? We'll see what you think next year when your feet grow and we don't have money for new shoes. Mark stopped laughing. We'll get by, Luke's mother said quietly. We always have. Dad shoved back from the table. Why didn't I get a permit? He asked no one in particular. Maybe if I just get a permit. By then Luke had read the rest of the letter. They don't give out permits for hydroponics, he said. This says it's always illegal. This time he only got a glare from Dad. Luke felt his father's disappointment, and seeing his parents so worried about money made a small voice whisper in the back of his head. Maybe if they didn't have you, they could afford everything they want. But he didn't eat that much, and all of his clothes were hand-me-downs from Matthew and Mark. And how much could it cost to heat his attic room? Sometimes he found ice crystals on the chair he sat in to watch the neighborhood. He tried to ignore the voice. What bothered him more was that without the hydroponics idea to keep him busy, Dad barely left the farm for the rest of the winter. Luke made it over to Jen's only once in all of February, and twice in March, when Dad began driving around looking for the best seed corn prices. But each time, Jen greeted him with big hugs and acted genuinely thrilled to see him. Her tantrum in January seemed forgotten. One day, the two of them made a huge mess of the Talbots' kitchen, baking cookies. Won't your parents mind? Luke asked when Jen scolded him for attempting to clean the flour handprints off the cabinets and refrigerator and stove. Are you kidding? I want this preserved. They'll be thrilled to see any sign of domesticity on my part, Jen said. Another time they played board games all morning, sprawled out on the floor of the Talbots' family room. The third day, they just spent the whole time talking. Jen kept Luke enthralled with stories of places she'd been, people she'd met, things she'd seen. When I was little, Mom used to take me to a playgroup that was all third children, Jen said. She giggled. The thing was, it was all government officials' kids. I think some of the parents didn't even like kids. They just thought it was a status symbol to break the population law and get away with it. What'd you do at the playgroup? Luke asked. Played, of course. Everybody had a lot of toys. And one of the kids had a dog he brought with him sometimes, and we all took turn feeding it dog biscuits. These people had pets too? Luke asked incredulously. Well, you know, they were barons, Jen said. Luke frowned. He slid down in the soft couch, so different from anything in his own house. My dad says that when he was little, just about everybody he knew had pets. He had a dog named Bootsy and a cat named Stripe. He talks about them all the time. Why'd the government make pets illegal? Oh, you know, the food thing, Jen said. She took a chocolate chip cookie from the pack they were sharing and waved it for emphasis. Without dogs and cats, there's more food for humans. My dad says if it weren't for the barons breaking the law, lots of species would have gone extinct. Luke looked at the cookie in his own hand. So now, was he supposed to feel guilty about eating food that should have gone to animals as well as to other people? Jen saw his expression. Hey, don't go dopey on me, she said. It's all a scam, remember? There's more than enough food in the world, especially now that there aren't enough babies being born. What? Luke asked. Well, besides passing the population law, the government went on this big campaign to make women think it was something evil to have kids. They put posters up in all the cities with things like, who's the worst criminal, under a picture of a pregnant lady and, I don't know, some tough-looking crooks. And then if you read the whole sign, it'd tell you that the woman was the worst one. Another one, Jen giggled. It had a picture of a huge pregnant belly with the label, ladies, do you want to look like this? And women aren't allowed to go anywhere once they get pregnant. So now my dad told me there are so few babies being born that the population's going to be cut in half. Luke shook his head, confused as usual. So why doesn't the government take down the signs and let people have as many babies as they want? Jen rolled her eyes. Luke, you've got to stop thinking this makes any sense, Jen said. It's the government, remember? That's why we've got to have the rally. Luke changed the subject as quickly as he could. All right. So Jen is like totally on board this whole rally thing. She really wants to get all of the third children to get together and tell the government that they don't like this. It's a bad idea. What do you think about this rally idea? Do you think it's going to work? Is Jen's idea really going to work? Are they going to be able to be free? What do you think? Let me know.